Okay, welcome to our final event for Native American Studies Week 2021. Again, I want to thank Elizabeth Streeter Avalar for organizing this week and taking on the Herculean task of putting this all together. We've had some great speakers and programs this week. Many, if not all of them, will be available on YouTube in the near future. If you just go to YouTube and type in Native American Studies Center, it'll take you to our page. And you can see some of the events that occurred earlier this week. We also want to thank Oceanic Gold for their support of Native American Studies here at USC Lancaster. And we want to thank the administration of USCL, the administration of Palmetto College, and the larger university for their support as well. We've been talking about science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics this week, STEAM, and Native American history and culture. And we're going to conclude this week by talking about one of my favorite topics, obviously, food. So let me introduce our speaker. Chef Dave Smoke McCluskey is a Mohawk chef and miller and native foods educator from the Northeast that resides here in South Carolina, with over 30 years as a chef in the food industry, and most recently as a micro miller for small batch hominy from native heirloom and landrace corn that is produced with the traditional use of hardwood ash and corn mafia and lying Mohawk offerings, L-Y-E-I-N-G. He often links native science and agriculture into his appearances. We're delighted to have him join us today to talk about indigenous food traditions. So please join me in welcoming Chef David McCluskey.
Good morning, everyone. How are we all doing today? Getting a little chilly out there for us, huh? Where shall I start here? I'm going to start about talking about my favorite subject, which would be corn. So we're going to talk the science of what I do with corn, which is to make hominy. From hominy, I make grits and cornmeal and corn flour, or masa harina, which would be dried flour, which would make tortillas and tamales and corn chips and things like that. Corn is this process that I'll be talking about is called nixtamalization, and it is it's how we change our pH in our cook water, and that pH change in our cook water removes the outer shell of the corn. So you know, when y'all eat popcorn, you get those little pieces of shell in your teeth. That's what I'm removing during this process. In the absence of gluten, it's the one thing that makes corn stick together. So as I change the pH with the water through the use of hardwood ash, or sometimes I use pickling lime, what you're trying to do is you're trying to make the solution melt the pericarp from the corn. So the pericarp is that outer shell. So in the absence of the gluten, that turns to a gel, or some of that shell turns to a gel, and it allows that dough to stick together. And then we can have things like the corn chips and things like that. Without that, you couldn't have that. That's one of the first parts about nixtamalization. That's kind of a cool scientific thing, because it's like doing an experiment in a lab when I'm cooking. As we change the pH in the water, our corn will change color. So that's how I often know that the chemical reaction is starting to happen. So we cook for a few hours from there. And as we cook and then we let rest, the whole process is kind of started, our little experiment there with our corns going on, and it's slowly melting that pericarp. What it's also doing at that point is it's converting some of the corn to niacin, which would previously be unavailable to us for our diet. That's one of the things here in the South that made people sick when they ate so much corn before acceptable wheat strains were found that would grow here in the South. General European Americans did not nixtamalize corn or make hominy, though we as natives would have shown them this. I call it either arrogance, hubris, or laziness, that they decided not to do that, and they paid dearly. So we would come up with things that would make them sick. So pellagra would be that thing that would make them sick and wasting and weak. So by not going through that process, that's one of the things you lack niacin, and you have a deficiency and you start to get sick. So, but also during that process, it also unlocks the vitamins and minerals that are in the corn that are also previously unavailable to this scientific process, if you will. So it also makes it easier to digest because of that pericarp is in there. So you can eat less and get more nutrients and whatnot. So at this point, we let it go overnight, and then we rinse that pericarp off depending on what we're going to use it for. If I was going to make masa to make corn chips and whatnot, I would maybe rinse it once, and you're rinsing away some of that higher pH water as well. But you try not to wash too much of the pericarp away, because again, that's what makes that weak gel as we grind it. So from there, you know, as you're making the tortillas, if you feel like, or I don't know if you all have the handout here, you'll see perfectly washed corn that has all of the pericarp gone with just the seed tip on there, or the corn tip on there. That corn there would be for a host of different things. I grind corn like that for grits. I grind it for cornmeal. We leave them whole to make soup with. So in Mexican cooking, you would have pozole. So if I wanted to make pozole out of this corn, I would take that tip off. So we would absorb more liquid into that corn. It would kind of puff up a little bit, like you see the hominy in the cans, which is kind of a nasty product. But, hominy in cans just doesn't do so well, but it's the most basic of things. So as you can see me stirring there is a pot of corn soup, and lots of fun went on there. We did that with hardwood ash, and that was all cooked outside. We tend to view these soups as something that is kind of a vehicle, if you will. So we add lots of other things to these soups as we please, and there'll be a few people probably arguing with me about that at some point if I'm going to read who's online. But this is just one of the things that I point out too as science. That's the science of food. So just that there will point to us having a little bit of scientific knowledge in the process of processing the corn into something a lot more healthier for us to eat. It sustains us. So with the addition of, let me backtrack here. So with the way that we grow corn, has anyone heard of the Three Sisters, or the Three Sisters diet? Okay, so the Three Sisters is from, I'm Mohawk, so the Three Sisters is from our creation story. So the Three Sisters are corn, bean, and squash, and we as a people grow those things together because we have lesson stories that tell us about the three things growing together. It's my belief that this is just a lesson for us to talk about more so than it is some scientists and other folks, or I guess I shouldn't call them scientists, archaeologists might say that it's a nice myth, and there's a mythology to it. I would argue the contrary, because my people tell what's referred to as lesson stories. So we tell nice stories to keep people kind of enthralled and listening to me. And then at the end of the story, I'll tell you why we've talked about this and why the Three Sisters grow together. All right, so we're going to talk about the growth right now because that is science as well. So the three planted together, the corn is generally planted first, and then a week to 2 weeks later, we plant our beans and squash next to it. So the corn itself grows tall, and it provides something for the beans to grow up. So there's support there for the beans. The beans actually produce nitrogen, which corn loves in the ground. Corn really needs nitrogen to grow. So the beans are there, and they're providing nitrogen for the corn at some point to eat or for the next season to be in the ground with. So the beans will grow up the corn, which is great for picking and whatnot. And thirdly, the squash or the pumpkins is what I tended to grow here in South Carolina. And the pumpkins spread out. So the pumpkins provide almost a ground cover for your corn, tends to tamp down the weeds somewhat, but what it does is it traps moisture there for the corn and the beans to live off of. So this was noticed as three things that will grow together that are almost in a symbiotic relationship. So this is another bit of that science that we talk about, that these three things grow together because they're beneficial for each other. So that's people through observation seeing that. There are other things that some folks will say that are other sisters, like would be potatoes or tomatoes or tobacco or sunflower seeds would be a big one. Sunflower plants. Those are also sisters that are part of our creation story, if you will, but the three things together are the most important thing, because the three things together provide us with more energy per acre than any other plant culture or monoculture that's grown anywhere in the world. So these three things provide us with the vitamins and minerals and nutrients, proteins even, that we need to survive. So this was the base of our diet. Colonials, when they showed up here, noticed how healthy we all were and how bigger, much taller we were, and stronger, healthier people. This is a big reason why, is that this was the base of our diet. These things are what I refer to as vehicles for us to use with other foods. So it's not to say that we were exclusively farmers. Most of us were also foragers as well, and still hunting, though we weren't nomadic any longer. So we lived in villages and we moved around here and there, or our men traveled throughout our regions to hunt and harvest things. So at different points of the year, we might move to different places, but we were still pretty stationary as far as villages go. So lastly, with this another example of science is that the three together provide us with those nutrients and vitamins and minerals that all other plants combined don't give us. So that's another kind of a big observation there that we recognized over thousands of years. The Mexicans, the Mexican folks, or what is now Mexico folks, developed this system, cultivated corn first about 10,000 years ago. Beans are about 8,000 years ago, and squash are anywhere between 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. Squash are younger because they grew wild. And we didn't start to cultivate them until we needed them as we migrated northwards. Most of us will tell creation stories where we're migrating northwards. So this corn we can date to about 1,800 years ago. So that's part of our migration. 1,800 years ago, we can trace this corn back to northern Mexico. It's a little bit different than some of the other folks talk about with the land bridge and whatnot. We moved around quite a bit. And the land bridge isn't always the only theory now about migration here in the Americas. There's several points where folks think that we've made our first arrival here in the Americas, which predate Europeans. Again, sorry to tell you. So we're also going to talk a little bit about the nixtamalization itself, or I guess the observation that it does all the beneficial stuff for us, for our diet, and for growing. But what it also does is by changing the pH in that water, we kill the mycotoxins and things that'll grow on corn as it dries in the field. So this is a part of food that a lot of people don't like to talk about. As things grow in the field, they get mold on them. They get bugs laying their eggs on them. They get bugs eating them. And as we bring it into the dry, or as it sits in the field to dry, we eventually bring that in, and that's where we develop things over time. Insects and bugs and molds will ruin the food because they've always been there. So the process of me lying the corn, which is my secondary word when he introduced me and said lying Mohawk, LYE. LYE is that part of the nixtamalization. So lye, or we all may have heard lye. We use hardwood ash to make that weak lye solution to change the pH of the water. So that solution kills the toxins, kills any little bugs or anything like that are living on the corn, or we could use it with wheat or other things, but it kills everything on there. So typically in most European American mills, we do not wash our corn. We do not treat it in any way. So you've got a shelf life of about a year. Maybe if you're lucky, really depends on heat and humidity as to when the moths start coming out and the weevils start coming out. That's reality with food. With me making hominy out of that, I remove all of that. So I start from day one again. So the day you start picking corn that's fresh and you're never going to do anything else to it but put it in a silo and wait to grind it up, you're on countdown. So you might get a year out of it, you might get a year and a half, if you're lucky, but 9 times out of 10, you've got stuff crawling out of it, within a year. And that's just how the life cycle goes of certain insects, if you will. So this happens with all of our food. So let's not think that we're not, that we're somehow getting cleaner food if we're buying organics or if we're not buying organics, or this is just always going to happen. You can spray that corn. I wouldn't really want to eat that corn with things that'll kind of inhibit some of that. Some people put a little bit of heat to it. Some people gas their silos, so they back gas. I think it's CO2 or maybe another gas into their silos to help kind of slow that process down. But with raw corn, you just never really slow it down completely, unless again you've treated it with a chemical or you've cooked it, and then you've changed it when you've cooked it even. So when I cook everything, I could put all this in a box, and probably after I've bagged it, it probably lasts 3 to 4 to 5 years. So there's that difference there, because I've gotten rid of the I've gotten rid of the germ, and I've gotten rid of the oil in that process of cooking, so it gives me a longer shelf life to it. And all of those observations to me mean that somebody watched this, somebody understood this process and understood that this process is what allowed us to store our food for longer periods of time, because not every year is a good year for all of your farm stuff. So it allows us to keep things for 4 or 5 years, and we tended to, as the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois folks, we tended to keep 5 years worth of stores in our villages. So we would keep thousands of bushels a year, tens of thousands of bushels, depending on the village, just of corn. We dried our beans obviously as well, and we dried our squashes as well. So all of that stuff would hang in a. We lived in what are referred to as longhouses. So it'd be a building similar to, just picture this, and we cut this off. This would be one space, and it'd be a central fire down the middle with some smoke holes on the top, and everything would hang. The corn would dry, the beans would be in baskets, and they'd all get hung in the rafters. And the squash would get cut in spirals a lot of the time, and those would get hung up on sticks. So a lot of that stuff got very smoky and was preserved. So the bugs tended to stay out of there, and because there was always a fire going. So not a lot of rodents really were there at the time. We didn't have rats in America predating European contact. Europeans brought rats with them, just like they brought cats. Neither of which we had here, so we didn't have that problem here. We had rodent problems for sure with mice, but not neither breed of rat that is here in the Americas were here previous to first contact. So we didn't have to worry about a lot of that stuff. Other rodents, yes. What else can I say here with science here? There's a lot of things with our diets. We can point to drying. So things like jerky are another way that we would be able to preserve meat for years at a time. And it's unlike the jerky you find in the stores now that's kind of pliable, and it's really, I don't know, overly salty. We dried things to the point of desiccation. So they were completely dried, and then we stored from there. So it's just how we use them later that allowed us to use meat that was a year or two old, or sometimes longer. Meat was not a huge part of our diets, contrary to popular belief, in most of our diets. So particularly here in the Southeast and the Northeast, deer wasn't a huge deal. I mean, we ate a lot of it, but we didn't, it wasn't like we had deer steak with every meal or out hunting deer every day. We had lots of the nut mast here in the Southeast. So you've got hickory nuts and chestnuts and acorns and all kinds of things that are what I refer to as the alternate protein source here in the South. So as you look at historic documents, you notice that we ate quite a bit of these things, that we don't as much anymore because we've all been kind of forced on the reservations. So we haven't necessarily kept our home territory, so we don't keep that tradition alive as much. But a lot of our diets were varied. So meat often was a flavor or was a substitution, because if we ate corned beans and squash already, we were already getting all the protein that we needed from beans for the most part. So some chunks of venison in there was flavoring. And again, that would be hung in the rafters. to dry. So a lot of that was very smoky. So a lot of our foods were either super fresh, or when they were dried, they had a little bit of smoke to them. So we dried a lot of things around fires. So we didn't necessarily cure things with salt, but we did have salt in our diets. So this food would be a little bit healthier as well, as opposed to big salted hams and salted lamb and things like that. So another part that we can talk about as far as science goes is forest management. And we're hearing a little bit more about that now with the fires out west that are going on. And it's talked about natives used to burn off the forest out west, but we also used to burn off the forests here. As you burn off the forest, you burn off the understory. So as you burn off the understory yearly or every other year, you don't leave a lot of fuel for much larger fires to continue to burn and kill the larger trees. We generally did this to save our nuts. So we managed these parts of the forest that had huge forests of trees that provided us with that alternate source of protein. So again, this is kind of an understanding of nature that is different than what European Americans were able to kind of grasp. And they just thought we were burning off the forest for who knows what. But you can read portions where colonists were complaining about my people burning off the hillsides. And that was a lot of the time was just to stop wildfires and because there were forests of nuts there. There were hickory nuts, there were chestnuts. Chestnuts would be a big one. So there were forests of chestnut trees and they got burned off because that's where we gathered our chestnuts in the fall. So it's actually healthier for the ground if we burn off like that as well. And we understood that. So the nutrients that are thrown back down in the ground provides a lot of things, time to grow up again in the spring and be healthy. And it provides better ground for our insects and our pollinators and stuff like that because flowers grow. So it's not just saplings and kind of vines growing like it does here. That's a pretty big thing to me to see that we were able to manage such vast spaces without anyone really paying attention to us doing that or not really understanding why. And we've kind of gone on rampantly here since first contact of cutting all the trees down and putting fires out for some reason because people don't like to smell smoke near their houses or their $1 million houses on the sides of cliffs. They don't like to smell the smoke or they wonder why they're falling into the creeks because, well, they don't have any trees anymore. This is one of the things that I point out as far as our understanding with the world and the earth was completely different than the settlers that came here. The people that colonized the Americas generally viewed us as the least smart of the people. And 400 or 500 years later, we're finding out that the whole process of resource extraction from our mother isn't so beneficial to the rest of us or to the planet. Yet we're still going about doing that. So it's just how a different relationship with nature forms. And we are part of nature. Nature does not belong to us. So that's how we tend to view things with nature. So we respect things differently. It's not to be extracted. It's not to be burned and made into everything you can think of and sold. Things have inherent rights to them. So we talk about science, but sometimes we also just talk about things that really need to be left alone, if you will. So, and then we manage things as well. So life here was a lot more complicated than a lot of folks give us credit for. And we manage fish, we manage streams, we manage all kinds of things here that just were not paid attention to by the settlers or by the colonials. And now we're finding things out, or things that we're talking about, regenerative agriculture. These are things that we've been doing for thousands of years that are now somehow the hot new way to grow plants. So we talk about a lot of this stuff, and it's really nothing new. And it's been here for a long time. We're just rediscovering things. There's other sciences, I guess, that we could talk about, but they're pulling me aside now, and I can't figure out what I was going to say about them. But there's just a lot of things that we grew and we knew about, and 70% of the world's crops today are native to the Americas. So the crops grown around the world, over 70% of them are native here to the Americas. And that points to agriculture and advancements in agriculture that just didn't exist around the rest of the world. Europe spent a lot of times eating very simple porridges with some basic wheats, when we had a rich culture of food that existed of our own crops. So corn in itself is about 2,000 years younger than your basic wheats, but not of, it's almost on par once it starts to be cultivated with the wheat advancements. So not that far apart when you think about things, and wheat didn't really start to appear in Europe until well after that. So pretty advanced as far as agriculture went, and we kind of knew how to grow things, and that's all observation. That's a certain degree of intelligence that's a little bit different than trying to manage everything. So we managed our crops per se, so we still did crop selection. Corn was actually at one point was what's referred to as teosinte, which was a grass, and that grass was observed, and we could call it genetic modification nowadays because it fits the bill. A lot of people think that that's a bad term, but selecting seeds year in and year out is genetic modification. So we can pick the seeds that we think grow best or look best or have the most desirable characteristics to them that we want in our, say, corn or our beans or our squash, and we select those seeds, and the rest get turned into food. So the rest is food, and what we have enough to plant next year is, say, all of the beans that are the most red, or the corn that is the most white, or its fattest kernels, depending on how we want it. So some of the corn that I grew this year is 13, 14 inches long and grew over 12 feet tall. But some of the other corn that I had was 10 inches and maybe grew 10 or 11 feet tall. So we select for a lot of these things. So I have a lot of my corn that I grew separated as to what we're going to grind up and cook and eat, and what we're going to plant next year. And that's back to those corns that are about 1,800 years old. Those corns, most of my corn either came from the Cherokee Nation in North Carolina, or from the Tuscarora Nation, which originally was from North Carolina as well, but the southern part. So some of the Tuscarora folks are cousins, and they've moved to New York about the 1700s. About 70% of those folks moved north, and some of the folks, much like the Seminoles, stayed in the swamps and moved to the swamps and stayed in the swamps and stayed in our old territory. So they're still there in North Carolina, though they're not recognized by North Carolina. But sometimes I grow one of their corns, which is Tuscarora White, which that Tuscarora White flour corn is related to all of the other white corns that the Iroquois people grow. So the Cherokee are growing a corn that's related to that Tuscarora White. If you look at them side by side, they're so close, but they're separated generally by a few hundred years of our body of people. So all of Cherokee, Tuscaroras, Mohawks, Onondagas, Cayugas, Oneidas, Senecas, and several other, the Meharans, and I think there's one or two others over in North Carolina that are Iroquois-speaking people. So we came here as one body of people, and we kind of spread out as we found places where we like to settle. All of us that grow that similar corn more than likely brought that corn with us, or shared it with each other as we started to use that corn, and it all looks similar. It's all very related, but some of that Tuscarora corn will grow almost 2 feet long. But some of the stuff that's not as happy, or maybe is in shorter growing seasons, drops down about 8 or 10 inches. But it looks to be the same corn. It all just depends on how happy things are. My corn this year grew probably better than the Cherokee folks did up in North Carolina, because I don't have elk roaming through my part of South Carolina. So they get issues with animals coming in. We had a little bit of issues with deer walking through, but this corn will grow so much higher that the deer walk in and they're about this level, eye level, or this eye level, and they don't see the corn that's up here. They might smell it and the fat raccoons are too fat to get up the stalks way up here. So we didn't lose a lot of corn this year. We grew what's referred to as a Dutch fork Cherokee pumpkin. And they're pumpkins that were here in South Carolina. It's believed to be a Cherokee village that when the colonists chased whoever was living in that village off, more than likely Cherokees, found these fields of these pumpkins. They're big, beautiful pumpkins. They're almost like a jack-o'-lantern, but they're very similar to what a Seminole pumpkin is. They're dusty orange, and they'll develop a hard skin on the outside. And the folks in Dutch Fork liked these pumpkins so much they kind of kept the variety alive. And I'm still kind of growing, and I refer to it as an ethnically cleansed variety or a genocidal variety that's been kept alive. Some people, that puts them off a little bit, but I think it's fun to keep that alive still, because we should keep it alive. But we shouldn't just not talk about the genocide that went on here to keep that corn and to keep the squashes that are here still. A lot of folks don't like to talk about a lot of the things that went on here in the Southeast, but I talk about it. I don't call it Trail of Tears. I don't call it forced removal. I call it what it is, and it was genocide, and it was ethnic cleansing. A lot of that stuff that went on, I don't always think was necessarily about just land, period. It was about cleared land, particularly farmland. So it's a lot easier for a small group of people to come in and kill or run off a village that has vast croplands that there's taken them hundreds of years to chop trees down and cultivate these lands. So South Carolina, North Carolina, kind of the southern parts of these states, along the coast and into Georgia and Florida are all very violent places. Parts of Virginia, they were violent before the colonials got here. They were much more violent after the colonials got here. There were 5 language groups in this region, and they were all at conflict all the time. But that didn't always mean that everyone got killed off. Some people got killed, and they shrunk and swelled. So small villages would be attacked and might lose some people. That village may go join another village. That village grows a little bit. So we were talking a little bit earlier about the Catawba doing very similar things, where there's many different groups of people that are part of the Catawba Nation. And that went on here all over the Southeast. So where I live now, at one point there was the Wesco people, which were an Iroquoian people, and they were the most powerful people in the region for a while. The Savannah River for a while was named the Wesco River, and they were here for, I think, less than 100 years. But they kind of cemented their place here in the fur trade for a little while, and were eventually chased off by the Muskogee Creek, and but at kind of the behest of the Charleston colony for trade. So a lot of what went on here was to do with trade, and be it furs. I think it was deer skin here for the most part, rather than beaver. But I think a lot of the people getting chased off were about cleared land, because if you've ever seen old growth forest and how big trees are, you realize if you don't have saws and mules and everything else to cut them down, it's a lot of work. And even if you do just have hand saws, it's a lot of work over many years to clear off dozens of acres that'll provide for a village. So that's one of my theories, is that things were all about land, but about cleared land before the forest, before it was about the forest. Because you've got a people that were here for a few thousand years previous to the invasion, and they've made a nice home for themselves and have all the nice places to grow things along the rivers or along the river bottoms and whatnot. So the Southeast is an interesting place here, kind of on the coast and into North Carolina. The northern parts of the state were, different. We're just kind of a different area, a little bit more agricultural. So as you go further south, it's more living off the land. So by where I am in Augusta, there was a little bit of farming, but not to the degree of what there would be up further north, like here and even further north. Just because the land was different. That's right on the fall line there. So there's a lot of clay, there's a lot of sand. So there's 2 different kind of levels and ecosystems. And as I forage through the forests that have been clear cut, you get secondary growth of pine which is a quick growing tree. So those are what mainly populated our forests here. As you go a little bit further south and things have been clear cut. I mean, even here it's been clear cut, but it's still a little bit different because there's more hardwoods. But that created an ecosystem in the southeast that is not even close to what it once was. So yeah, and we know these things now because we can see the lessening of species of birds and insects and animals that are in our woods that used to be here and are no longer here. So talking about science, we can now see what deforestation and rampant resource extraction from the country has done to which was once a very rich area, and could have provided for a lot of folks. Anyone have any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Back on the corn, when you do that process, did that also to the corn cause it to kill like the germination so that the
Yes.
corn would not?
Yep. So the germ is completely gone by the time I'm done with the process.
Okay.
So what I've noticed as I sometimes will spill a little bit on the ground as I'm cooking or it gets swept outside is that insects and animals walk right by it. So it's not really picked up by the squirrels. I could leave a pile of hominy outside and nobody touches it. It's one of the last things that they touch. And what I think is that germ's gone and the oil is gone as well. So those are two things that I think animals smell and they go, oh, that's food. It could be a wood chip now for all beef, for all the said and done here. So healthier for them to eat probably, but doesn't smell as good. So yeah, it's one of those observations as I've probably cooked thousands of pounds of this. So as I sit there and kind of ponder things, I have to baby it at the same time. I got to stir it in the pot, and you see a lot of different changes and you see a lot of different things. So as I've spilled things on the ground, or if I've just thrown some of the stuff away that's maybe fallen in the dirt, it doesn't go anywhere. The ants don't even touch it. So that's another benefit actually for storage. So we're using it as a starch that has a little bit more vitamins and minerals in it and has that niacin in it. So it's healthier for us to eat than the fresh stuff that everyone else wants to eat. But the one thing about that pericarp is it makes a lot of that corn indigestible as well. So sometimes I talk about when you see people are feeding dogs cheap dog food, a lot of that filler is raw corn. So a lot of that dog food doesn't get processed. So the dogs has real big presence for you out in the yard. I've got 140 pounds Great Pyrenees. That's it's like this because we feed him food that he can digest. So corn a lot of the time is a big filler. So when you see corn in a lot of your products that you're eating, it's a hollow filler that the companies are using because it's cheap. So it makes you feel full, but you're not really digesting much of it. It's not really. It's the real calories are really this because you're getting you're getting your vitamins and nutrients from the things that they've added back to it. And even still knowing this about nixtamalization, our corporations and governments still decide to go that route of just grinding raw corn. And then we add niacin and vitamins and minerals back to the corn when it's all there for free, if we just do the work. So most of Mexico exists on hominy, so if most of Mexico can exist on that, I think that America could as well, just given a little bit of extra effort, and it's a healthier thing for us to eat. It's just marginally healthier on its own, but it's still something better for you to eat than just the raw corn. So we all kind of stay set in our ways, if you will. Anyone else? I'm talking about every type of bean with the exception of adzuki and soy are native to the Americas. So all of your common beans, even your lima beans, are native to the Americas. So pre-contact with Europeans, Europe did not have any of these beans. So This is another example of a contribution that the people of the Americas gave to the world that is so vitally important to the world's diet now. Without it, there'd be a lot of people that would be starving because there's whole cultures now that almost exist on beans. It provides that protein for people. So just about everything grew wild. And as you select things, as you pick those beans in the wild, you would start to select the seeds every year as you grew it for the more desirable products. So sometimes that would be for the pod you're eating green beans, and other times it would be for what's in that pod. That could be flavor, that could just be size, it could be for whatever. Because some of our corn, some of our beans were also used in ceremonial fashion. So some things sometimes were grown for decoration, for just eating at certain times of the year. So we didn't grow a lot of them. And there's corns that are like that. We have a black corn that starts out as a sweet corn that we can dry and use, but that was generally for one of our naming ceremonies for the boys. We didn't eat a lot of it, but it was a sweet corn. We enjoyed it when we had it. So just very different things than Europeans would think of things. It produces more, it gets us more money and things like that. A lot of it tastes good. It looks nice. It's pleasing to the eye. Or it just does really well in, say, clay soil. Like I planted some of my beans that I brought down from up north 2 years ago in my yard, and I'm on red clay. And the beans I've noticed seem to love red clay. But when I planted them out where I planted my corn, which is all in nice loamy soil, I lost most of my beans last year from the previous year, just there in that soil. It's just the corn was super happy, but the beans weren't. So you tend to pick things and grow them where they do best. So and that's what the selection is really all about. So we cook. I mean, we grow corn, but sometimes you can't just plant any corn. You have to plant a corn that's, let's say happy where you've planted it. And sometimes that corn will do well here. It just needs a few generations to grow and get adjusted to the climate as you select seeds again. So it's still the same corn, but you're selecting the best of the ears and the seeds from your plants that did best, and the rest of it you're kind of putting in the eat pile, if you will. Yeah.
I had a question about, you were talking about seeds, and then you mentioned the specific kind of pumpkin from North Carolina.
South Carolina.
Oh, South
Dutch
Carolina.
fork, yeah.
Where do you get those seeds?
I got mine from Nat Bradford, who's here in South Carolina. He grows Bradford watermelons as well. So
it's just kind of who you know.
Well, sort of. I have things that are culturally you'll never get a hold of. And then there's other things that people trade things on and off. So I think the Dutch fork is available through one of the seed companies now. I'm not sure who, because I was kind of part of that when they're getting brought back. I was given a few seeds to kind of check out. So I've been growing them since then because I liked them. But Nat gave me a few of those pumpkins, geez, 6-7 years ago. He just gave me a few as a gift, and I was cooking a boucherie down in Charleston. So we cooked it there at the boucherie, and we roasted one of them. But I saved the seeds from the other two and replanted those the next year, and I've been planting them every year since. They're super happy here because they've been selected to be here in South Carolina. So I've previously bought Seminole pumpkin seeds to grow, and they'll do well here, but the difference of the meat on the inside is huge. So these are, whoever selected them, the folks that settled in Dutch Fork selected these for size and the meatiness on the inside, which is really the whole point in growing some of these things. But the Seminole pumpkin, a lot of the time, is a nice looking pumpkin, but it's a very hard shell, and then you don't get a lot on the inside. So to me, it's, a lot of work for a little bit of meat. So there isn't too much sense for me to say to keep growing the Seminole pumpkin, though. That's theirs to keep alive, and that's what they ate. And probably does very well in Florida or North or South Georgia. So again, that's all back to selecting things. I have one that's some that I grow that were a cross between the Seminole and the Dutch Fork, because there's only 3 of us in my family. So a big 15 or 20 pound pumpkin doesn't get eaten by the 3 of us. So so they're a little bit smaller, but they're meatier. So I've again selected seeds for that. The ones that don't have a lot of meat in them, I toss and we eat, but I mean, I don't save those seeds. So that's what kind of seed selection is all about. That's what genetic modification really is. Excuse me, is you're saving the strain of gene that you like, or that you think is the most favorable to your yard or to your region, or just to your palate even. So some of it's just flavor.
So there isn't a group who might be trying to.
You could Google Dutch fork pumpkin. I just don't know who's picked them up to sell commercially. They've made it onto the Slow Food Ark of Taste, so that means they're endangered. So there's probably maybe two companies doing that now that are selling some of those seeds, but they'd be small. Nat Bradford at Bradford Watermelons would be someone to contact. Though I'm not sure how many he's been growing, but I think I saw a social media picture with him, a whole porch full of them. So he should have plenty of seeds.
All right, thank you.
I've got 15 now still in the field. I've given 15 away. So
We have a few questions on Zoom.
sure.
One person asked, do you sell the food that you make? And if so, where and how can we purchase?
I do. I own a company called Corn Mafia, which is kind of a little bit of this here that you'll see is our logo. Right now, it's been strictly word of mouth for the past year due to pandemic. And soon I'll have a website up. But if you follow me on Instagram, or if you email me at codchef@gmail.com, I'll be happy to send you a product list. Currently, we're doing 3 different corns as grits, cornmeal, and masa, which would be corn flour. And then we're doing 2 others as whole hominy. So they're all about $9 a pound plus shipping. I ship flat rate, so 1 to 4 pounds is about $9 through the post office.
A couple more. What is your favorite way to cook corn, beans, and squash as a meal?
We call it Three Sisters stew, if you will. So that soup that you see me serving on this on the ad here for us, that soup already has corn and beans in it. I would simply add squash to that. This one here, because it was in the spring, this is at the spring in Michigan. So we have ramps in there, which are wild onions, and we have some mushrooms that we foraged for that day. But generally, if they would be together, they would be in a soup. They'd be in a soup or a stew, just because culturally, that's how we did it. I suppose you could do a casserole if you wanted to. It's more work.
Next person says, when you spoke about burning the trees, I'm assuming they need the forest area, was this process to burn younger trees, older trees, or to drop nuts?
It was to all of the understory, so not just younger trees, but the weeds and the vines and all the stuff that just isn't conducive to nut harvest, but it also burned off the leaves and everything else that were there that would generally tamp fires down. So even if you did have a wildfire, there's less fuel for that fire to burn, which is what they're finding out west, is because they fought fires for the past 80, 90 years. There's 2 or 3 feet of detritus, if you will, there. That's really the fuel that fuels a lot of those fires. So they go on for days and days, and then those fires then kill the trees that are there, that then they have to cut down and drop, and they don't haul them all off. So again, it's just kind of a vicious cycle of things that are burning. So as you cut tree rings, you can see where fires are. So scientists can see where there's been damage and nice happy years where there's plenty of water, and other years where it's been dry, and then other years where it's had fire, because the trees keep growing. So there's rings there that they can tell from the rings.
And this person says, thank you so much for giving this talk. Would you detail the next process more than you have? This is all new to me. Not sure.
What process?
I'm not sure. I'm gonna ask.
With the mask, with
The nut mask?
acorns,
Mhm.
and would a flour be made out of it?
Yes. So hickory nuts generally are much harder to get out of the nutshell. So those would be processed differently than say chestnuts or acorns. But acorns generally are full of tannins. So acorns would need to be removed from the shell. Depending if the skin sticks on or not, that'd need to get taken off. And then you either grind them or pound them up, and then you add water. Usually you add cold water to it, and you let it sit, and you keep changing that water until the tannins are gone. So that could be a week's worth of water changes. So you're changing every day. So you're dumping all the water out and straining it out, putting it back in. In a modern fashion, a cousin of mine was talking about that they used to take nylons, women's nylons, and they'd put all of that in there, and they'd put 4 or 5 5-gallon buckets there, and they'd agitate them in each bucket, and that tannin turns the water yellow. And as they went along with the buckets, maybe they dump it all out and start all over again. But towards the end, it would be clear water. So that meant that most of the tannins were gone from the nut meat, and then that would be dried and then ground into flour and used. And that could be used in biscuits. It could be used in all kinds of things.
Yeah, I guess I have made some myself, and I just didn't know, I was wondering, I like the process.
Well, there's many different ways to do it. Yeah.
It is-
Alternately back hundreds and hundreds of years ago, my people made baskets. So you made baskets that were tightly woven, that were loosely woven. So they're almost like strainers. If be set in a stream, would be set in a moving stream. So that stream would do all your work. So we even washed our corn that way. So after the nixtamalization process, when it would be time to rinse, it'd go in a basket that had holes that were enough to keep the corn in, but to let everything else through. So you set that in there, and so nature does the work for you. That today, now I agitated a 5-gallon bucket or my big pot, and hose out and change water a few times. So ingenious stuff, but nobody makes baskets like that anymore. We make a lot of decorative stuff. We don't. There's a few of my friends that'll make our pots that we can cook, that we used to cook in, but just because stuff is traditional doesn't mean it's better all the time. So I often kind of tease some of my friends here in the Southeast for still wearing buckskins, because when cloth came, it was all over. Cloth was easier to sew than buckskins and whatnot. So a lot of us in the Northeast gave up wearing buckskins. We moved to other things. So it was the same thing with pots and pans. A copper pot is a lot easier to carry than a big clay pot. It's a lot more fragile as well. So we moved things around and modernized as things went along.
The next question is, were grits part of the Native American diet or more just the hominy?
All of it was. So grits is kind of a European word. So we referred to it as mush. Some of us in the Northeast would just call it corn mush. So we're probably some of the only people left in the North that'll eat this, but we call it mush. We've never called it grits. So grits is kind of a regional name, and I say grits just because folks here recognize it. Some of my northern friends I'm developing a bunch of clientele out west as well, know what grits are, but they can't really buy them up there. So because I ship, I'm getting folks bringing stuff out there to eat. But almost anyone kind of north of Mexico that had corn, ground it up to use in certain things. So not all of us had tortillas and things like that, but most of us all have tamales under various different names as well. So we didn't have tortillas, but we had that dough. So we used that dough generally to make what we call cornbread. So they're big flat discs, kind of like what corn pones used to be. And we boiled them. So they had beans mixed in there with the corn that's been ground, and they got boiled. And what we like to do with them, either hot out of the water, there'd be a little bit of bear grease or something on there to season it with the salt. But secondarily, and then next morning, you fry a little bit of that in the fat, usually on a rock, and they get a little bit crispy. So real nice thing to eat in the morning. So it's kind of an acquired taste. It's very heavy. I made them the other year for Dave Shields, who's professor emeritus at USC, who's also the head of the Slow Food Southeast. I made him some of that bread with chestnut flour. because we used a lot of chestnuts. So we don't have that history here because our chestnut trees are gone for the most part. So there's a lot of nuts that got added to things. Sometimes I put hickory nuts in my mush. They're real good as well. But they're the best way to extract hickory nut meat is to crack all the nuts, put it in a pot, and quickly just give it a boil, and the nuts will separate from the hard shell, because you can't really get that meat out of there without it being a real hours-long process. The oil will float to the top. So what they used to do in olden times is they would strain that oil off first. We didn't have a lot of sources of oil. So when we found that oil and fat, we didn't have big sources of either one. So when we saw those things, we extracted them and saved them. So we didn't saute food. Generally, it was a flavoring. So that hickory nut was beautiful, but you drizzled it on things. But secondarily after that, you would strain the nuts off. You put those on mats and dry them out for later eating. I throw those right in grits. And then that milk that's left over in that pot with all the shells in the bottom, you'd strain that off again. And I make my grits with that. And it's killer. You could do the same thing if you wanted to try something like that. You could take pecans, and you could take some of them and you could crush them up, and you could boil some in some water. And then you could, kind of strain all that off and then cook your grits in that water with a little bit of milk, and then add the nuts back after you've toasted them a little bit. And it's a really great flavor that you'll not forget. But it's different, but those are two very Southern things that we're eating here like that previous to contact. And then a little of the oil on top if you want.
Does anybody here have any further questions?
We had Glenn Robbins. Anthony was here a few years ago, and he talked about how a lot of the heritage grain corn that he found, was going out and talking to moonshiners who were preserving that particular corn. Like, is there
That's Glenn.
Yeah.
That's all how Glenn kind of does his research, but yeah.
Is there a tradition of drinking corn-based drinks?
Things like the Cherokee and some of the other folks here in the Southeast drank something what was referred to as soft key, which I believe is the Creek word for it. Generally, that's the little bit of the water, the corn water that maybe the whole corn's been cooking in, and that water's saved. And a lot of the time, it's either drunk right there, or alternately, it's left to sit for a day or two, and it sours up a little bit, and folks like that. But so maybe lightly alcoholic, but nothing really like beer or wine or things like that. So moonshiners saved these corns and selected these corns for the starch content. So starch converts to sugar when it's cooked at a certain temperature. So the more sugar you can get out of that corn, the higher your alcohol is going to be. So the higher alcohol you can have as your first process of converting things, which would be like a corn beer, which is what they didn't even really care about the flavor for, because they were going to distill that. And that's what turns into White Dog, which eventually turns into bourbon. So it's moonshine and then bourbon. So you would age that in casks. And that's part of the reason why you age it in casks, is to cut down on that just real acrid, raw alcohol flavor, because it's the process that you started with that corn liquor in the beginning just isn't a very good beer, because they just kind of throw some sugar in with it and let it rot in barrels, if you will, or kind of ferment without any real thought process of making sure that tastes good as well. So the thing that you start with first for making liquors or liqueurs is a good quality product in the beginning. So good brandies start with good wine, or good wine from wine skins and some of the leftover things. And then they're aged. So your cheapest ones are made from the cheapest ingredients and don't usually taste quite as good or aren't as smooth.
Does anybody else have any more questions?
Which of the three systems is hardest to grow and why?
They're all pretty easy to grow, actually. It's just having the right varieties growing together. They all have their moments. At times, like corn sometimes needs a good soil to grow in, or it might fall over in the wind. And beans like to grow with the corn, but we also grow bush beans that'll just grow kind of in a bush, which is why people like the bush ones sometimes if they don't need to crawl up things. Squash here in the southeast can be a temperamental thing because of the vine boring beetles. So I lose a lot of squash to beetles, and that's just because I don't want to spray. So maybe if I sprayed, they might be fine, but I haven't sprayed in my yard in 20 years, so I'm not really going to start spraying for them now. But I grow the Dutch fork that seem pretty resistant to all the local beetles and vine borers, so that's what I grow. But I've tried to grow several other squash at the house, and they do well until the beetles enter in. So beans, all of it all depends on the soil that you're growing it in. So if you're growing in a crappy soil, you're not going to get a good product no matter what type of strain you have, or your neighbors are doing better, but maybe they fertilize. So they all have their moments, but corn, if it's in a, if it's in a decent area and it's acclimated to the climate, does pretty well, and you just leave it alone. If you're getting enough rain, you shouldn't have any issues with it. But it all depends on the seasonal growth and the rain and whatnot, as well as the soil. But they're all pretty easy to grow as far as things go. Water being the biggest key thing.
Yeah, one final question from our chat. Becky says, I'm gonna call her out a little bit. Have you cooked whole hominy with black walnuts or hickory nuts before?
Hickory nuts, yes. Not black walnuts. My son and I will gather black walnuts, but we generally make stain from them. So I've been showing him the past few years how to make all natural organic stain. Just the different times of the year when those are dropping. I'm super busy here in the fall. I know you've noticed on my social media. So I miss out on things. So our black walnuts, we have 2 little stashes of black walnuts, but they're out in the woods that I don't have time to get to in the fall. Some of the time. My hickory nuts didn't produce this year, which I think is the weather. 2 years ago, I got 200 pounds of them. This year, I've hardly seen any. So, but my friends said the same thing with their pecans. They got several hundred pounds last year, and this year with all the moisture, they didn't get as many, or they don't look as good as they did last year. So they had a bumper crop and they needed it because of COVID. They needed to bring in a little extra money, and they got it. So, but yeah, the hickory nuts, I throw those in there quite often whenever I have them, and it's because I've been the chef in residence for the Chickasaw Nation for 2 different times in the summertime, and I wanted their kids to learn some of their own food versus me just kind of teaching them foods that I know. And once I read about how they used to extract the nut meats and the oil out of everything, that was on for me. So I'll smack those up and throw them in my pressure cooker for about 20 minutes, and it pops all the meat out. I can strain the oil off, and I can dry the meat again, and then I can use that liquor, if you will, or that nut milk to make my grits with. And then the rest of it gets roasted and thrown in there too. It's just there's a picture on my Instagram. If any of you have Instagram, there's a picture from last week sometime, and there's that exact dish. So that dish was hickory nuts on top. There was some of the milk cooked in with it, and there might be a little bit of oil drizzled on it if I remember correctly. But that original dish I cooked with soured corn, which would be the soft key that I just talked about. So the soft key can either be a drink or it can be a porridge. So what I did is I let the corn ferment a little bit in my refrigerator for a month or 2, and it takes on a real nice, pleasant kind of sour aroma. It's different. So if you like fermented things, it won't bother you. But if you don't eat anything fermented, you might kind of go, "Ooh, that's bad," but it's not bad at all. Plus, I brought it to a boil. So we cooked it from that point, and it was really good. So. Sometimes I sweeten it a little bit too.
That sounds good. You're at lunchtime, so that sounds real good.
Any other questions here or online?
We're good.
I'm really good.
All right.
What happens when you have a chef roll?
Right.
Yeah. We can get you his.
I almost did, yeah.
We can get you his email address and he'll put you in touch with his company, his business.
Virginia Tech.
Yeah, we had thought about it, and with COVID, it's like everything, it's disruptive. And then, well, we thought, well, we'll do this half in person, half online. And I would have felt really bad for the folks online. You're welcome to click whatever you like.
Yeah.
Our team said thank you, great presentation.
Thank you. Yeah, we've canceled, but we just put on again for next year. We do over in Augusta, we do what's referred to as a boucherie, which is a Cajun style event where we teach nose to tail butchery of generally a hog, but that's kind of morphed into doing chickens and ducks and turkeys and whatnot. And we show farmers, chefs, and lay people how to do this whole process. And it's a tradition that's still alive with the Cajun folks. So we tour around the Southeast doing this. So we hold one in Augusta, but because of COVID, we've canceled 2 of them.
Yeah.
So next year, we've just decided that we're going to have one again. We're out on 40, 50 acres there. So
Yeah, call us.
we've got enough. We've got enough space. So, but that's a 2-day event. It's not that far from.
Yeah,
it's a fun event.
I went to school in Lafayette, Louisiana.
Okay,
I'm
so you know,
familiar with the-
I do them with John Folsom.
Oh, yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Baton Rouge. John's a friend.
Oh, nice. Okay, well, again, we want to thank Chef Dave. And thank you all for joining us here today and online. And for those of you who were part of the week, we really appreciate your support. I want to mention that the next Lunch and Learn will be Friday, December 10th, and our speaker will be Hannah Bauer, formerly of the South Carolina Commission for Minority Affairs, who will be giving a presentation entitled, quote, "Really, you don't look like an Indian," unquote, an examination of Native American representation through mascots in South Carolina. So we hope you will join us for that. And for those of you here, feel free to walk around, tour the building. We have an exhibit that's still in the works. Is this one open?
It's pretty much finished.
Okay, so the one behind me here is almost finished, but it's there if you would like to go through. That's a exhibit featuring Catawba artists, traditional artists that we had programs with over the summer. In here, we have the exhibit that corresponds or complements this week of events, Native American technology through the ages. Our permanent Catawba Pottery Gallery is over here to the right, and then throughout the building, you'll see, and of course, in the center here, we have the work of Alex Osborne, a contemporary Catawba artist, graphic artist who was here last night, and his talk will be on YouTube at some point in the near future. But feel free to tour the facilities, and some of us are going to go have lunch. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.